Welcome to Mastercast 28 Minutes to COP28 podcast series. This series is dedicated to exploring important topics related to ESG with a goal to offering fresh insights beyond the conventional discussions. I'm Andrea and I lead Mastercard Foundry, specializing in ESG and gaming for the Eastern Europe, Middle East, and Africa region. And I'm super honored to be your host for the next 28 minutes. So now let's begin with a really incredible story on how merchants can make a significant change and impact. All of you probably know McDonald's, but I am sure that you didn't know that McDonald's had implemented a biodiesel program to power its supply delivery truck in several countries, including UAE, where we are streaming from, UK and Netherlands. So this program converts used cooking oil from McDonald's restaurants into 100% biodiesel. This is just an incredible way how you can power an entire fleet of trucks. In the UAE, where I live, and Karl lives as well, McDonald's has been using biodiesel to power its entire fleet of trucks since 2011. So imagine that's 12 years already since this is happening, and I'm sure many of us didn't know. And this biodiesel is made from used cooking oil collected in McDonald's restaurants. So if you go to McDonald's or you order from McDonald's, all that cooking oil which is used in there, it's converted to biodiesel. This initiative was so successful that it gained recognition from the UAE government and its stakeholders worldwide for its commitment to sustainable transportation and environmental protection. I'm sure you're asking yourself what impact it had. So the trucks have traveled 22 million kilometers on 100% biodiesel since the partnership began. So that was 12 years ago, and saving more than 25 million kilograms of CO2. And that's without modification to the engines or loss of fuel economy. And that I think this is truly remarkable, because you have to think, I'm sure you had or probably they had to change all the trucks and, what they did with the trucks. So you didn't have to change anything. The biodiesel program has a significant impact also on reduce McDonald's carbon footprint and contributed to a sustainable circular economy for the restaurant chain. If you think about it, we spoke about how much of carbon emissions they decrease, but to put it into perspective, that is the same as the carbon sequenced by growing by 385,698 tree seedlings into full-grown trees in 10 years. That's just simply remarkable. So now, as you can see, I'm super excited about the topic, and I want to introduce you to the driving force behind this incredible initiative and my distinct guest, Karl Feilder. Karl's entrepreneurial journey began with his first company, which is many years ago, which he sold to Microsoft. And he has since guided numerous companies through various stages of his growth. He built 6 companies, including one of global logistic company Deutsche Post DHL, and leading 2 companies in their initial public offering. So his expertise is truly exceptional. In 2007, he was invited to lead DHL climate change strategy, which marked a significant step towards sustainability. Again, DHL obviously very strongly connected to carbon emissions. Following this, Karl spent 5 years leading the creation and execution of McDonald's carbon reduction strategy, which I spoke about before. And I just spoke about UAE, but he did this in 37 countries, APMEA, based out of Dubai. For a decade, Karl has been a pioneer in commercial biofuel production in Middle East, with neutral fuels becoming the GCC largest and most successful biofuel producer, and supplying clean fuel to renowned organizations like McDonald's, Nestle, ADNOC, ENOC, Emirates, Etihad, among others. These are the biggest brands which we know, obviously. He was also recognized by the World Economic Forum as a technology pioneer, and Karl was selected as as one of the members of Mohammed bin Rashid Innovation Fund Accelerator Program. So currently, I'm sure you wonder what is currently up to now, because his career is so amazing. He is currently preparing a neutral fuel for IPO, assisting a VR software company called Eon Reality to merge into SPAC on NASDAQ. And he's even writing his 3rd book for his rock bank Sandstorm. You actually should check out his website. And Karl looks very good in his suit, but he has a fantastic picture on his motorbike. It doesn't look anything like him. So he has a different side to him as well. So Karl, it's an absolute honor to have you with us today. And I'm extending super welcome to you. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Andrea. I have to say, I'm probably blushing the same color as your blouse at the moment. It's It's quite embarrassing listening to somebody rattle off all those things. I'm sure I can't remember half of them, but we definitely did those things. Yes.
No, no, you definitely did, and I think it's a good positive way to blush about. So, you yourself, you have defined your mission as helping corporates save our species, which is a really big goal. Can you elaborate on how the sustainability strategy contribute to this goal and share some example from your career besides what you already spoke about?
Yes, I got involved in this at the end of 2006 when my wife made me the challenge of doing something more important than making money. And I said to the, what could be more important than making money? She said, well, it looks like we're having a real problem with climate change, and you need to work out how to save our species. It's not about saving the planet. The planet's going to be fine. It's just the fact that our way of life, the way that we've all grown up, is going to have to dramatically change. And it will be impacted by massive weather events and other catastrophes and things that we can't even predict at the moment. So in 2006, I started researching this and realized that actually most carbon footprints are created by companies. They're not created by individuals. They're created by companies and the decisions that companies make. And rather than trying to persuade every member of the general public to change what they're doing, I thought it would be easier to just change big companies and change the way that they do things. So, for example, the McDonald's example is a classic. We've changed the carbon footprint of their logistics system by reducing it with biofuel usage from their own waste stream. We've done that at absolutely zero impact to the customers. The customers haven't seen any increase in price. The customers haven't had to change or do anything. They still go to the same restaurant, they buy a Big Mac and fries, and they come home, they enjoy the food, and the carbon footprint has been decreased, but without them actually taking any action
Knowing,
at all.
yeah.
And this, in my view, is probably what we need to do on a broader scale. We need to get large organizations to make lower carbon decisions and eventually net zero decisions so that they can offer their customers an alternative between low carbon, lower carbon, and even lower carbon. And the customer doesn't have to decide on doing anything.
I really like that approach, However, as a consumer, I would have loved to know that, McDonald's is doing things like that, and of course, bigger brands as well. And you work McDonald's and DHL, and obviously been trying to achieve the same kind of aspects. I think that the audience is probably really wondering what are some of the challenges for you to do that, because you just said that I think when we started and what you said, I love what your wife obviously challenged you, right? I think she delegated the execution to you. Brilliant woman. But what were some of the challenges and great learnings which you had on this journey from these companies which you worked with?
Well, one of the greatest challenges is the fact that people don't like change. I think there's been a lot written in the sustainability agenda about how there are vested interests and people are too selfish, and all that the old boys running the networks want to do is play golf. And there's a lot of pushback saying that people are not wanting to embrace climate change and carbon reduction actions. I don't think it's so much that they are selfish or that they are stupid, because they're clearly not stupid. I think the thing is that people just find it very difficult to change. So when I was working at Deutsche Post DHL, the board asked me to go and visit the head of development for one of the vehicle brands in Germany. And I went to see their head of research and development. And at that stage, Deutsche Post DHL had 58,000 vehicles from this one manufacturer. And we said to them, we'd like to place a new order for 58,000 vehicles with you, but we want them all to be electric. And the head of R&D for that company, who, okay, yes, he was probably in his late 50s, and yes, he was a man. But he said, I'm sorry, that's not a large enough order for us to actually change our production systems. I'm sorry, but you're going to have to carry on buying normal petrol and normal diesel vehicles. Now, the good thing that came out of that was I reported back to the board and said, this particular manufacturer doesn't want to help us in our decarbonization journey. So it took about a year or two, but Deutsche Post actually went out and bought its own car company and started
Awesome.
making its own electric vehicles, because they said, well, if the car industry doesn't want to play, we're big enough, we'll do it ourselves. So they went out, bought a car company that I think they've produced so far maybe 10,000 of these vehicles. And they're out there delivering packages, delivering letters, doing all the things that they should be doing. And of course, the funny thing is that the company that I went to see is now one of the leading producers of electric vehicles in the world. It's just, it took them 10 years to do it. We were asking them to do it in 2008, and it took them until 2018 before they actually caught up. Now, while that's a sort of positive success story, those 10 years are lost. Those are 10 years of carbon emissions that we can't
Emission.
back.
Exactly.
So we need people to just move faster. And I'm absolutely certain I cannot convince every customer in the world to change their behavior, but I can persuade big corporations to change their behavior, especially if it makes financial sense to them.
That's awesome. I think, what you share is a really great testimony of innovation. And often we think about innovation, something completely new, right? But I think that innovation is also not to say take no for an answer and create a completely different solution. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit more on what role does the innovation play in achieving sustainability goals? You spoke about obviously moving faster, doing things by yourself if you want. I think it would be really great to understand some of these approaches.
Well, it requires entrepreneurs and not just mad people sitting in a laboratory somewhere dreaming up crazy things. It requires entrepreneurs that can create technologies that scale. And the challenge there is that many of those smaller scale businesses cannot engage with large companies. The mechanisms are just not there for them to engage. So we have to find a way of bridging the technology gap and the deployment gap, so that large companies are quite good at rolling out programs, but they're not very good at innovating. So we need to get the innovators in front of the large companies and show them solutions, and also let those smaller innovators understand the complexity of deploying things on a large scale. Again, coming back to the example with DHL, when we started, they were trying to do their carbon footprint. And they had one man with a clipboard who was visiting locations and writing down literally how many light bulbs they had and what the buildings were made of and how many goods movements there were in and out of the building to try and calculate the carbon footprint. And when I arrived, I think he'd done about 6 buildings in 3 months. And that was pretty good going. And in the next 6 months, we did 3,500 buildings. And the way we did that was to write some software and ask the people that were based in those buildings to simply log onto a website and answer a bunch of questions. In the end, we ended up doing the questions in different languages and with lots of pictures, because we couldn't be totally sure everybody spoke English. But that meant that we were able to do the entire global carbon footprint for DHL in the space of about 9 months, and to have it done on a monthly basis, and to link it to the actual KPIs for the managers of those facilities. So we put a financial incentive in there, we put a fair and objective measurement system in place, and we put a series of business-related KPIs in place. This wasn't rocket science. I mean, any MBA student could have sat down and thought this up. The fact was that there was some very forward-thinking board members at DHL Deutsche Post who said to me, Karl, come in and look at this differently. Tell us something new, and then we'll help you roll it out. And that's exactly what we did. And
I love the example, Karl, because you said 9 months, right? And as you were talking, I was just thinking in my brain, with today's technology, you could probably do it in a week. You could install Internet of Things sensors in the different operations. You could use satellites for looking what is the energy consumptions from the buildings. And
but I think, Andrea,
incredible, it's amazing.
But that does actually underline the complexity of it. The challenge in these organizations is that they are very, very large. When we started this, DHL's global carbon footprint was the same as 46 countries put together. So there's only about 200 countries in the world. So there's nearly a quarter of the world's countries with one company. And yet at the end of the first year, we managed to reduce their carbon footprint by 5%. And the same the end of the second year. And the thing is that the United Nations has failed to reduce the carbon footprint of all those countries
Yes.
over the last 40 years. So just by sitting down once a month, having a review meeting, having some sensible business decisions and some courageous leaders in that organization, we were able to make real change and make real difference. And it's now become an ingrained part of DHL's global strategy, as it should be, to work out better and newer ways of reducing their carbon footprint. It's become normal for them to look for ways to save carbon. And that, you know, they're not the only example in the world. It's just the ones that I know the best. McDonald's equally. When I approached them in 2011 and said, I think we can run all of your vehicles on 100% biofuel, no fossil fuel, and my calculations say that you make enough waste oil from your normal frying operations to entirely power your fleet. And they looked at me a little bit strange and said, okay, well, let's prove it. And so I said, okay, I'll build a factory and I'll convert the cooking oil for you and you'll use it and we'll do it. And in fact, to correct your introduction number, we've just gone through 25 million kilometers on 100% biofuel. And in fact, that's the only place in the world where that's happened. The McDonald's UAE team has won lots and lots of praise. They've won internal awards. They've been recognized by McDonald's corporate for their bold decisions. And that's what it took. It took courage, a bit of a leap of faith. Obviously, we mitigated any of the risks. We looked at whatever we could to reduce the downside impact of any of this. But in the end, we found that we were right. We could run 100% biofuel without modifying the engines at all. In fact, the engines last a little bit longer because the biofuel is slightly more slippery than normal diesel. So it actually worked extremely well. But the common factor between that and the DHL example was courageous leadership.
You know, it feels almost like these organizations are like Titanic, right? They're like these big boats which move super slow, but once you move them a little bit, the impact is so dramatic and can really change the course of many actions. And, you know, I want to stay a little bit on the biofuel because biofuels are really great inventions. And many of us didn't know what biofuels are. And, you know, kids are not learning much around it as well at school either. And officially it got named in the 19th century, but as humans we've been using biomass, which is the earliest form of biofuel from wood, animal fats, plant oils, you know, for thousands of years. And I think it'd be really fascinating to understand how significant is it, you know, what can you achieve what if we would all switch to biofuels or to, you know, other sources? What is the impact? Because you're really pioneering this part of, you know, work globally.
It is interesting that whenever I start the conversation, people say, well, I didn't realize that. But the diesel engine was actually invented by a gentleman called Rudolf Karl Diesel. His middle name was the same as my name. But anyway, he was
it's just coincidence, Karl.
No, I'm sure it's not coincidence. It's a sign. But he invented the engine, and the original oil that he ran the engine on was peanut oil. It was squeezed from peanuts.
Fascinating.
And then we discovered that we could drill for oil in various countries of the world, and we had this very energy-dense source of transportation fuel, and that became petrol and kerosene and diesel and all the other fuels that derive from crude oil. And it is a marvelous substance. The downside is that when you burn it, it combines with oxygen, forms carbon dioxide, which turns out to be a greenhouse gas. And there are other nasties that are also produced during the combustion process. The thing that is amazing is that we've been using these fossil fuels certainly crude oil, for about 150 years. It took 300 million years for them to be formed.
Yes.
And in the last 150 years, we've used, by most estimates, about half of the available stock. It took 300 million years to put it there, and we've used half of it in the last 150 years. So when people say to me, can we replace all of our fuel usage with biofuels? We don't have 300 million years divided by 2. We don't have 150 million years to grow those crops or breed those animals or derive that amount of biomass. The challenge that we have, first of all, is we need to work out how to be more efficient in our usage of every fuel, whether that's a fossil fuel or a biofuel. And we've done that. I mean, the last 15 years, there have been dramatic improvements in the fuel efficiency of cars and trucks, and they have got better. They're still not good enough, and they're still not as efficient in terms of the energy calculations as electric vehicles. Electric vehicles, from an energy conversion perspective or energy transfer perspective, are actually far more efficient.
Far more efficient.
But if we want to use the millions and millions of vehicles that are out there, we need to find a fuel that we can put in them that has less impact to the environment. And that is straightforwardly the biofuels.
That's amazing.
The important thing is that we have to make the biofuels from a waste stream, not from a fresh stream. And I keep getting asked that question, oh, can't we just grow more crops so that we can turn them into biofuel? Well, the problem is, on Earth, we can't feed all of the people that we have at the moment. So if we have spare land that we could be growing crops, I would argue that we should be growing food for people rather than crops for fuel.
Yeah, exactly.
So we don't really have that much spare land that we could turn to this. There is land, lots of land in Africa that could be used for growing crops, but some reason world economics mean that we don't use it for growing food for people at the moment. So what we have to do is make better use of the waste that we produce. So I'm currently on a campaign that I'm calling "Don't Waste Our Waste," because at the moment we are treating waste as if it's a problem and just hoping somebody takes it away and it sort of disappears from our world and we don't have to worry about it anymore. Whereas waste is actually the natural resource for most of these green fuels. It's something we need to protect. It's something we need to manage properly. It's something we need to measure. And it's something that we need to convert locally into a locally used fuel.
And it's fascinating because as you were talking, I was thinking, as a consumer, right? Obviously, you're making it on a much bigger scale, right? But as a consumer, whenever I use cooking oil, right, I don't know what to do with it, right? I mean, in Europe, obviously, I'm from Czech Republic. My mom puts it in the bottles, and there are special places where she can, bring it for recycling. But for example, here, I don't have a way how to recycle any of that. If I think about, the millions of households where people use it because it's a traditional part of their diet, all of that, it's getting wasted, right? I think that's a really interesting perspective to say how, with this big movement of recycling and being more responsible, how we can look at these kind of raw materials as well, which from a household perspective, we don't use anymore. And it brings me to one point which I'm super, excited about, which is circular economy. And, you mentioned that a closed loop recycling model, which in nutshell stands for, principle where things are used all over and all over and all over again and not throwing them away. That it really helps the environment and save resources. I want to ask, how does the circular economy, contribute? I think it's true that it's contribute, but there are some of the big challenges from your perspective to actually really install in the companies and in us as a consumer the real circularity. So reuse from raw materials until the final product.
Yeah, it's a little bit more complicated than people realize. It sounds very, very logical, which is let's use our own waste to produce something that we can then use in our business as a substitute for a fresh material. And that sounds a lot of sense. But what it needs is an infrastructure, and it also requires you to think about the logistics flows. And this is where we've decided that the real answer to much of this is to completely change the way that we produce fuel on the planet. So at the moment, because of the 150 years history of the fossil fuel industry and the fact that fossil fuel is only found in a few locations, we've got used to the idea of drilling the fossil fuel, the crude oil, in a few locations, putting it in a lot of ships, and then shipping it halfway around the world to a refinery where it's then refined into the finished products and then distributed by sea, by road, by rail, to wherever we need to use it. And that's based on the fact that there are only a few places where the crude oil starts from. These waste streams actually exist everywhere where there is a high density of population. And the requirement to use them is also anywhere where there's a high density of population. In other words, cities. If you've got a city of 3 million people, it produces enough waste to produce a factory there that will convert that waste into the fuel that the 3 million people need. This is not, it's not just the circularity of using waste to produce something that's useful, it's the locality of it. Because if you don't have to move the raw materials halfway around the world, and if you don't have to move the finished goods halfway around the world, it's considerably better on the environment and it's more financially efficient. I've seen various calculations recently that show that 1/3 of the world's shipping is actually moving fossil fuels around the world. So if you wanted to reduce the carbon footprint of the shipping industry, just stop shipping fossil fuels. And of course, that's impractical in any short term. But what I'm trying to do is encourage businesses and indeed municipalities and cities to see their waste streams as a source of energy that they can convert locally into fuel and indeed power that they can use locally. So they don't need to be shipping things halfway around the world.
You know, it's fascinating, and because I come from Czech Republic, as I said, right? So I grew up during communism. I was about 16 when the wall came down, and it has a lot of things which people obviously can criticize, and you know, I had a great life myself, but one area which I never thought about until I came to the space of sustainability is that these countries which were so landlocked in a sense, right? Because you couldn't travel, you couldn't import, export, or just from the couple of neighboring countries, they were much more sustainable because everything was made in the country, right? There was if it was milk, if it was if it was bread, if it was coal, whatever, everything was done in a small location, and we didn't have so much of choices. But I grew up quite fine with 2 types of yogurt, right? I didn't need to have 50 different types of yogurt, which are shipped from France and Spain and America, and we had bananas once a year for Christmas, right? But I think that there is a lot of things which we can learn from some of these older systems, and I love what you said, the 3 million people concentration, but we should start to think about what can we learn and how can we stop being so global and being more local.
You're right. You're right. I mean, there's a lot to learn from history as well. I mean, if you look at, I teach a little bit about sustainability, and one of the examples I like giving is to ask the students, when do you think the first net zero city was powered by electricity? And the answer was in 1898. And it was
1988.
No, 1898.
18. Oh my God. Okay.
It was now the city of Niagara. They installed a hydroelectric power station on Niagara Falls, and they generated electricity, which put electric light through the entire city of Niagara. And we forgot about that. Most people don't even know, as an example. Then there was a lot of new technology that came on board. But the big difference was when they discovered crude oil in the United States and decided it was going to be a lot cheaper, rather than building a hydroelectric power station, which costs a lot to build, but is actually very cheap to operate. We diverted in our history. The other thing, come back to my childhood, I didn't grow up in the former East, I grew up in the former West, but I remember every morning listening before I went to school to the sound of the electric milk float. So this was an electric truck delivering milk to every single home, and it was bringing milk in glass bottles.
Glass bottles.
And the glass bottles were sealed with aluminium caps. And we used to collect the aluminium caps and take them into our local newsagent where they would recycle. They would send them back for recycling. The bottles from yesterday were always put out the night before, so the milkman collected the empty bottles. He entirely recycled the glass bottles to put fresh milk in them, and we had the whole lot delivered on an electric vehicle. And since then we now go to the supermarket, we buy these silly huge plastic containers, which always in everybody's fridge there is a container of milk that doesn't smell so good anymore because they bought too much. So when we were doing this, when I was kids, and certainly when you were kids, we definitely lived a bit more frugally. We lived more efficiently. And I'm not sure that it's great progress. Exactly as you said, I don't need 15 different styles of yogurt. I don't need, you go to a shop anywhere in the Middle East, I don't need 25 different types of water in the fridge.
Yeah, I agree with
all
you.
of this it's inefficiency.
Yeah.
And that's when I said earlier on, we're going to have to change the way we live our lives. But those decisions are best taken by the big manufacturers. So if the manufacturers decided to try and reduce the breadth of their product ranges, they would reduce their carbon footprints.
Definitely.
If they focused on efficiency of packaging, they would reduce their carbon footprint and they'd save money. And that's what it requires.
You mentioned that you teach as well, and I want to shift gears a little bit to the people side, right? And to the psychological profiling. How does psychological profiling relate to the success of different startup teams in the sustainability sector? Because so when we move from the technology to us humans, because ultimately it's us who can make the change.
Yes, but that's a really big question.
Should we add some time to the podcast?
I've spent 12 years so far researching the psychology of startup teams to write my PhD, and I'm still reading. I've written about 100 pages so far, but I'm still reading and still learning about this. But my conclusion is that there's a very small percentage of the population who are naturally inclined to become entrepreneurs. My primary research would seem to indicate it's about 3% of the population, and that 3% is relatively stable around the world in different countries. And those 3% of people are unusual. My wife says I shouldn't call us weird, but entrepreneurs are definitely a bit weird.
It's a good word.
We are unusual. And the thing is that a lot of those entrepreneurs who are required in startup teams have a lot of rough edges. They're lacking many skills. They have the key skills required to get up every morning, think that the world's broken and come up with solutions to fix it. But when it comes to thinking and communicating in a way that is likely to involve scaling their project, their idea, they sometimes are missing that. So what I thought a long time ago was that entrepreneurs are born but not made, but you can make them better by teaching. And that's what I've been trying to do, is to use some of the lessons from my life. I mean, I'm definitely an entrepreneur. I'm not the wildest, weirdest entrepreneur in the world. I've met some of those guys and they are truly wacky. And equally, I'm not the mildest entrepreneur who would probably be sitting in a research lab in a large organization as an intrapreneur. But there's things that I've learned. And one of the most important is being self-aware, realizing your own weaknesses, not necessarily telling somebody on a podcast what they are, but definitely realizing your own weaknesses.
They have people who do, right?
But if you can recognize them, you can do something about it. So I know that I don't like sitting there with financial spreadsheets day in, day out, because it bores me senseless. But I know that I can hire people who actually get a pleasure out of sitting there and playing with spreadsheets. So the key thing for an entrepreneur, and certainly as far as I can see, is you always need somebody financial to sit with you and almost on a peer level argue with you when you want to go off and boil the ocean doing something that they say, well, actually, maybe you want to think about doing it in a slightly different way, because there's always a good room for discussion in those type of situations. So
I really like that.
The balance of a startup team is, from a psychological perspective, is absolutely critical. And I'm a great fan of the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which basically categorizes people into 16 sort of personality types. And I think that there's a very good alignment between those personality types and the sort of roles that people are really comfortable in their work environment. And if you can map the personality types and the roles into what you need in a startup team, you can probably come up with a very successful startup team. And as you said in your very kind introduction, I've started a lot of companies and they've mostly been pretty successful. But the two most successful ones were the ones where I got the initial team right. And they then created a fabulously warm and supportive environment through the entire life of the company. And that was all about getting the right character types there, having the right skill sets that balanced each other. Gosh, we had some arguments, but the arguments were all coming from a very nice place. They were coming from shared belief in what we were trying to do, and intense passion in trying to execute it as efficiently and professionally as possible. And we had disagreements and different views, and that was extremely healthy. But that combination of skills is what startup teams need to have, with the sense that the world is broken and we need to fix it. It has to be.
It's an interesting learning, because I think that it's not only for startups, but for bigger companies and smaller teams in the bigger companies. It's just not to hire for your skills, but really to look at personality assessments and look at it more from a psychological level than only you have an MBA, you have an accounting degree, you speak this language, and you have so much of experience, and I kind of like you. And I think if we would create much more sustainable environment in a workplace as well, if we would apply these kind of principles which you just described on a much bigger scale, not only to startups, right? And I'm fascinated because you are a real global citizen. I think you had experience from 51 countries. That's that's it's really massive. And I mean, this is my almost last question, but I'm really curious is, what are some of the differences you observe? Because, I remember when I grew up and then I managed 11 markets in Eastern Europe, everybody would say we are different, right? I'm different and you're different. And then people always say, and I somehow think that an underlying factor on the basis, we all the same, we have the same needs. We express maybe ourselves differently, but as a human beings, if I need to, do something, I need to do it no matter if I'm Czech or British or South African like my husband. But maybe the way how we go around it, culture is slightly different. But I am really curious about what are some of the unique sustainability challenges which you see in the different regions, which you say that this was just here, it was nowhere else? Or do you think it's like everywhere the same, just the way how we look at it is a different way?
In fact, as thank you for assessing that. I mean, I have done business in many, many, many countries. I've started companies in more than 20 different legal jurisdictions. And the thing that struck me is when you boil people down to their core, actually, we're pretty much the same. It doesn't matter if you're South Korean or Japanese or South African or American. From wherever you are in the world, most people actually want to be happy. They want to have a very happy home life, and they want to have a future for their children if they want to have children. They want to see that there's a positive future. And if you can, in your business dealings, if you can boil the relationships down to a human level, then I find that it's often a lot easier to have a business relationship with people. So the starting point, certainly, it's something I've learned a lot since I've been living in the Middle East. The starting point for nearly every conversation has to be respect. And it has to be respect for people within their own culture. So there's no point in me going to Japan and saying, when I was in Germany doing sustainability, we did it like this, you should copy it. I have to actually respect the local culture in Japan, understand the challenges and some of the thinking. And, the Japanese have a fabulous history of looking after their own environment. And what I don't understand is that they're actually, on most international metrics, not doing very well on sustainability. So how do those two things not work together? How does the history not gel with the present? And that's about getting deeper and getting behind the conversation and asking people to really open up and tell us, in your society, what are some of the barriers? It's certainly wrong to walk in there and assume that you understand it, because you, as a foreigner, there's no way you can. But as an enabler and as somebody that maybe commands their respect and can say, well, let's think about this slightly differently, and how about this, and what do you think about that? It's more of an encouragement type of approach, as opposed to a stick. But it comes back to my core point, which is that if you can engage with the large organizations, they make the decisions on behalf of consumers every single day. Trying to get consumers to change their behavior is probably a 2 or 3 generation activity. And we don't have that much time left. Whereas most businesses work to maybe a 5 or a 10-year time frame. If it's in Japan or further afield, it may be a 20 or 25-year time frame, but they are thinking shorter term than a generation. And if we can get them to think on how to execute climate mitigation strategies that are shorter term, that produce financially beneficial results to the company, and they can execute with the people they've already got there, then that's the way we're going to actually tackle climate change. It's not going to be about United Nations edicts. It's not going to be about complicated calculation schemes or secondary or tertiary markets trading carbon credits and derivatives. That's not going to be it. It's going to be about getting large organizations that operate everywhere in the world to just do things differently.
I like it. We are in the end of the session. Before I close, I just want to ask you one more thing, and it's, I love the whole theme about it. Actually starts with us, right? It's at the big organization is the, the movers and shakers. What would you want to leave our audience with? One thing which, you would want them just to, and they say, I listened to this podcast, and what Karl said is just like, I can't forget it. I can't get it out of my head.
Well, people say often, they ask me, well, what can we do? And I think about it, nearly everyone has someone in their family who works for a company. Probably, hopefully, there's a breadwinner, there's somebody who works for a company in your family. If you are still hopefully sitting down maybe once a week over a dinner table, why don't you ask that person who works for a company if they would ask their company what they're doing about getting towards net zero? Because if we put pressure from within organizations to drive the organization towards a net zero strategy, then the leadership will feel more courageous to take those decisions. They'll feel that they've got their workforce with them, that the people want this to happen. I haven't met anybody who doesn't want to save the planet. And this conversation should be relatively straightforward. We have all got kids and we want to have grandchildren and we want them to have a better life than we've had. And at the moment we are doing exactly the opposite. So what we need to do is to get our companies to do something different, and the best pressure on the companies comes from within, because every company is only as good as its workforce.
Amazing. So, in closing, today, we have been able to explore corporate sustainability innovation with Karl, and he is a true pioneer in the field. He's built from biodiesel to circular economy, and we have heard how businesses can lead to charge and to change to greener future. I want all of you who've been listening and watching this to take lessons with you to, and make sustainability part of your journey. Please, after this session, do engage in the dinner conversation, as Karl was suggesting, because our choices and what we do shape the tomorrow. And somebody told me the other day that we are just borrowing this planet from our children. So, think about them and what we're doing. Karl, thank you so much. I felt like I went through a university of biofuel, sorry. It was incredible. I learned so much and I enjoyed. You have an incredible energy and patience. I am sure that everybody would, agree with me who will be listening to this session. To our listeners, thank you for joining 28 Minutes to COP28. Let's save our species through sustainability. Until next time, stay inspired. My name is Andrea, and it was such a great honor to host you today.